There is a wedding band pinned to the blood-spotted apron of a Union surgeon in a Gardner photograph at Antietam, September of 1862. The surgeon's wife had been dead for 19 months by the day of the photograph, so the ring is not hers. His own ring is on the fourth finger of his right hand in the plate, plain as anything, where the widowed wore them in the 1860s. The bright spot on the apron is a second ring, and in that second ring, pinned to cotton drill, 3 steps from the kepi of a dying Confederate boy from Mississippi, on the bloodiest day in American history, lies the whole story. I first saw this plate 15 years ago in the reading room of the Library of Congress, and I thought the bright pinpoint on Dr. Anson Hurd's apron was nothing more than his own band catching the developer. It is a thing you stop noticing. Then I read the registry of Tippecanoe County, Indiana, for the spring of '61, and I had to sit down. The country surgeon kneeling in a Maryland orchard over the 11th Mississippi private with the shattered femur had pinned to his apron the wedding ring of a woman he had barely known. 23,000 casualties between dawn and dusk that week, in 12 square miles of Maryland farmland, and Dr. Hurd had brought to the field a ring that did not belong to his wife. The photograph itself is well known to anyone who has spent time with the Civil War archive. It belongs to the Alexander Gardner series, taken on the battlefield at Sharpsburg in the days immediately following the battle, 2 days, perhaps 3, after the fighting ended. Gardner had come up from Washington with James Gibson, whose share of the credit on the Antietam series scholars still argue about. They were working out of a wagon, processing wet plates on the spot, breathing collodion fumes in the September heat. The dead were still lying where they fell along the Hagerstown Pike and in the Miller cornfield. Gardner's plate of Dr. Hurd is not one of the dead-on-the-field exposures. It is one of the few clearly composed studies he made of the living, taken at the field hospital, pitched in the orchard behind Smoketown, a mile and a half east of Sharpsburg. The image is a stereograph, half plate, on a glass negative now held by the Library of Congress in the Brady Gardner collection. The catalog number is on the back of the print at the reading room desk. You can pull it up online in 3 minutes. The surgeon kneels beside a wounded man on a straw pallet. The wounded man is a Confederate. You can tell by the cut of his jacket, by the homespun butternut wool, by the kepi laid across his chest. The surgeon is in shirt sleeves. He has rolled the sleeves above the elbow. His right hand rests on the man's bandaged thigh. His left hand is just out of frame. You only see the forearm. He wears an apron of cotton drill that was once white and is now stained in 3 different shades: the bright red of fresh blood, the rust of yesterday's blood, and the dark brown of 3 days' worth. Hurd has been operating since the 17th without sleep. The detail that catches, the one I want you to look at if you have the plate in front of you, is in the lower right of the apron, just above where the apron string is tied. It is a small object, almost lost in the foxing of the print. It is round, it is bright. It has a hole in the center. It is a ring, pinned to the apron with a small steel pin, like a sailor's wife pinning her husband's photograph to her shawl for a long voyage. Dr. Hurd was not a sailor. Dr. Hurd was a country physician from Lafayette, Indiana, who had volunteered as a regimental surgeon in June of '61. Why is there a wedding band pinned to his apron on the 17th of September, 1862? Names in this story are mostly real, except where families requested otherwise. The photograph and its provenance are as I described them, and the rings traveled through 3 generations of the Hurd line into a museum case I have stood in front of. Where the family tradition disagrees with the paper, I follow the family tradition and say so. You have to understand something about the field at Antietam before you understand the man on the apron. September 17, 1862, was the bloodiest single day in American history. 23,000 casualties between dawn and dusk, in roughly 12 square miles of farmland in western Maryland. The Union Army of the Potomac under McClellan had marched up from Washington to stop Lee's first invasion of the North. The 2 armies met along Antietam Creek. By sunset, the fields were still, and the moaning of the wounded carried for half a mile. The medical service of the Army of the Potomac in September of '62 was, by modern standards, primitive. By the standards of '61, it was a small revolution. Major Jonathan Letterman, the medical director, had just put in place the system that the Army would use for the rest of the war: forward deployed dressing stations, division-level field hospitals, an ambulance corps with dedicated wagons. Antietam was the first major test of Letterman's reforms. The system held more or less. Hurd's Division Hospital at Smoketown was one of about 70 field hospitals operating within 5 miles of the creek in the week after the battle. Some were in churches. Most were in barns. A few, like Smoketown, were tent cities pitched in orchards because the orchards had shade. Here I want to clear up a thing that people repeat to me at lectures and that I will admit I once half believed myself. The myth is that Civil War surgeons cut without anesthetic. They did not. By 1862, the Union Medical Service had standardized on chloroform. And at Antietam, by the regimental records I have read, the Union side actually used more chloroform per amputation than at any prior engagement. The Confederate side was already running short by Sharpsburg. By the second day of operations at Smoketown, the surgeons were splitting their stock with the Confederate wounded who had been left behind, because Lee's medical wagons had crossed the Potomac with the rest of the army. There are accounts in the Sanitary Commission record of Hurd handing over a bottle to a Maryland Confederate surgeon who came across the lines under truce, hat in hand. Hurd had a reputation for it. Lafayette papers mentioned it twice during the war and 3 times after. I am getting ahead of myself. Back to the apron and the ring. I first saw this photograph in the County Museum at Lafayette, Indiana, in 2003. I had driven up from Indianapolis on a Saturday looking for nothing in particular. The museum had a single case dedicated to Hurd. They have his commission, 2 letters home to a cousin, the rolling pin Mary had used in the kitchen, and a small velvet jeweler's box. In the box, 2 rings. Plain gold bands, hers and his, the kind you bought at a country jeweler for $9 the pair in 1855. I stood at that case for an hour. The card next to it gave Hurd's birth and death dates, and the regiment, and 1 sentence. Surgeon Hurd kept his wife's wedding ring with him through the war. No source, no detail, just the sentence. So you have a young country surgeon, recently widowed, who marches off to Antietam with his dead wife's wedding band sewn into his apron. That is the story the museum card tells. The plate Gardner exposed at Smoketown on the 20th of September shows the ring pinned to the apron in plain view. The chain of providence is unbroken. The rings in the case, the photograph in the Library of Congress, the surgeon's regimental file at the National Archives. They all line up. Then why does it take me 4 parts to tell this story? Because the museum card is wrong about which ring is which. Because the Lafayette papers I've been reading on microfilm at the Tippecanoe County Public Library do not say what the museum card says. Because there is a second woman in this story. Not a sweetheart, not a scandal, but a name that appears in Hurd's pension claim file in 1873 and that I had to chase for 2 weeks before I understood what she was doing there. And because the apron itself, the actual piece of cotton drill, sat in a box in the attic of the Hurd farmhouse outside Lafayette for 68 years before anyone opened it again. When they did in 1930, the apron had something pinned to the inside lining that was not visible in the Gardner plate. I will get to that in part 4. Let me sit with the Smoketown plate for a moment longer. The man on the pallet is a wounded Confederate, and that matters. Hurd had been ordered, like every Union surgeon at Antietam, to treat the wounded of both armies in the order the wounds came in. By the morning of the 18th, there were more Confederate wounded at Smoketown than Union, because Lee's army had retreated across the Potomac on the night of the 18th and left their seriously wounded behind. The Confederate soldier in the plate, I have spent some years trying to put a name on him, and I am not certain. The most I can say is that by the regimental hospital muster of the 17th, he is most likely a private of the 11th Mississippi, hit in the right femur by a mini ball at the cornfield, brought in on a Union ambulance somewhere after 4 in the afternoon. He is not in the death roll. He is in the parole roll of October 5th. He went home. He may have lived another 30 years. The pension files for Mississippi from that period are thin, because Mississippi did not keep good Confederate veteran records, and what records there were burnt twice, once in the Reconstruction State House fire and once in 1917. Look at the surgeon's face in the plate. You cannot quite see his eyes. The long exposure has blurred them, the way Civil War portraits of moving subjects always do, because no human being holds still for 8 seconds, not even at 30 years old in front of Matthew Brady's old apprentice. But you can see his mouth. It is set, not grim, set. The expression of a man who has been doing the same task for 60 hours and has another 12 in front of him before he can stop. He is 28 years old in this picture, and he looks 45. By the next year, fairly enough, he was 45 in his face, regardless of what the muster rolls said. A wedding ring on a surgeon's apron is nothing. A wedding ring sewn to the apron of a widowed surgeon, 18 months after his wife was buried in a country graveyard in Indiana, who is kneeling in a Maryland orchard over a dying Mississippian. That is something. The question I want to answer over the next 3 parts is whose ring it is. The museum card says it is hers. The plate, when you look very closely, says it is not. Not exactly. The diameter is wrong by perhaps a 1/16 of an inch. The band is thicker than the band in the velvet box. The pin is not quite in the center. I'm not certain, not yet. But I'm going to walk you through what the census says and what the Lafayette Daily Courier of April 1861 says, and what the regimental records of the 14th Indiana say. And at the end of part 3, I'm going to tell you what I think the ring is and whose name was inside it. By part 4, you will know the rest of Dr. Hurd's life, and I will tell you the small, bitter thing they found when they opened the apron in 1930. For now, sit with the photograph. A field hospital tent in an orchard. A widower in shirt sleeves. A Confederate boy on a straw pallet. A bright spot on the apron that catches the chemicals. The fields outside Sharpsburg are quiet in the afternoon. The day is the 20th of September, 1862. The war has another 2 years and 7 months to run. Dawn at Sharpsburg, September 17th, 1862, broke under a low Maryland fog. The fields between Antietam Creek and the Hagerstown Pike were already crowded by 5 in the morning. Hooker's First Corps had gone in across the east woods toward the Miller cornfield, and the firing began before there was light enough to see the men you were shooting at. By 6, the corn was already on fire in patches. By 7, Hooker himself had been shot through the foot and carried to the rear, and the 14th Indiana, with Dr. Anson Hurd attached as one of its assistant surgeons, was forming up in the Mumma Farm Lane to support the 2nd Corps' advance on the sunken road. The 14th Indiana was, on paper, an experienced regiment. The truth was a little more complicated. The 14th had been mustered in Terre Haute in June of '61, sent to Western Virginia under General Reynolds, and seen sharp fighting at Cheat Mountain and at Greenbrier River. It had not been in a major engagement before Antietam. It had buried more men from Camp Dysentery and Typhoid at Beverly than it had lost to Confederate bullets in the previous year. That, by the regimental returns I've read, is the dry arithmetic of the first year of the war for most Northern volunteer regiments. The disease killed 2 for every one the bullet killed, all the way through to 64 for some units. Hurd had joined the 14th in late August of '61. He was 27 years old then. He had read his medicine at one of the small Indiana medical schools of the 1850s and had practiced in Lafayette for 3 years, mostly midwifery and farm injuries in the long Indiana fevers of the Wabash Valley. The regimental records of the 14th list him as assistant surgeon with a commission dated August 29th, 1861, signed by Governor Morton. He drew $60 a month in rations. He left a 4-month-old grave behind him in Springvale Cemetery and a small farmhouse outside Lafayette in which the kitchen still held his wife's rolling pin and her teacup on the mantel. Mary Hurd had died of childbed fever on April 14th, 1861. 2 days after the baby, a boy, unnamed in the parish record, baptized at home by the Methodist minister. And the baby had followed her 3 days after that. The Lafayette Daily Courier of April 18th ran a small notice. Mrs. Mary Hurd, beloved wife of Dr. A. Hurd of this town, departed this life on the 14th instant, in the 24th year of her age, after a brief illness. Funeral from the family home. Friends invited. That is the whole notice. 2 days later, the Courier ran a much larger notice about Fort Sumter. The newspaper of that week, the one I have on microfilm at the Tippecanoe County Library, has Mary Hurd's death notice on page 2 and the Sumter Dispatch on page 1. You can read both columns side by side on the same sheet of film. It is the kind of historical accident that makes you stop the carousel and look out the window for a minute. I have stood at her grave. The stone gives only the name and the date, and underneath, beloved wife of A. Hurd. Aged 23 years, 4 months, 11 days. No mention of the child. The child is in the lot beside her under a smaller stone that simply says, infant son. There is no first name on either marker. What I am trying to give you here is the shape of the man who walked into the 14th Indiana's surgeon's tent in late August of 61. He was 27, recently widowed, no living children, a small medical practice in Lafayette he had given over to a partner named Dr. Cyrus Bicker. The Bicker name comes up again, I will get to that. And a long memory of his wife's last days that he did not write down anywhere I have been able to find. The letters he sent home from the war went to his cousin Lemuel Hurd of Crawfordsville, and Lemuel's grandson gave them to the county museum in 1968. There are 4. 3 are about the regiment. The 4th, dated October 2nd, 1862, 2 weeks after Antietam, says only this: Lemuel, I send you my address at present and the news that I am well. The work has been very hard. I will write a longer letter when I have slept. Tell Cousin Sarah I have the ring still, and it is safe. A. Hurd. Tell Cousin Sarah I have the ring still, and it is safe. That sentence is the reason I have been chasing this story for the last 12 years. We will come back to Sarah. First, the period and the place. What was around Anson Hurd on the 17th of September, 1862, and in the days before and after? Because the field hospital at Smoketown was not a place that existed in isolation. It was tied by ambulance road to the Sunken Road, by telegraph to Frederick and from Frederick to Washington, by railhead at Hagerstown to the Pennsylvania manufactories that were sending up bandage cotton and morphine, by personal letter to towns across the Midwest where families were already starting to read the casualty lists in the papers. In Lafayette, on the morning of the 17th, while Hurd was hearing his first cannon of the day, the Daily Courier had gone to press with the news of Lee's invasion of Maryland. The lead editorial called on Indiana boys in the field to fight the rebel host on the soil of a free state. By Friday the 19th, the Courier was running the first telegraphic dispatches from the field. By the 22nd, they had the casualty rolls. The 14th Indiana lost 78 killed and wounded at Antietam, mostly in the assault on the Sunken Road that morning. The Courier ran the regimental list on its second page on the 23rd. Dr. Hurd's name was not on it, which is to say, he was alive and unhurt, and the paper had been told as much. The governor that month was Oliver P. Morton, a Republican who had been running the state of Indiana on a kind of personal emergency dictatorship since the Democratic legislature had refused him war appropriations earlier in the year. The strike that summer in Lafayette was at the brickworks on 6th Street. The foreman had locked out the German molders over a wage dispute, and the German Lutheran congregation had voted to support the strikers, and the Methodist congregation had voted not to. That sort of small civic war was the underweather of every northern town in 1862. The big war was distant. The small ones were close at hand. The road from Smoketown to Sharpsburg ran past the Muma farm and past the Dunker Church, the little white-painted Brethren meeting house that Gardner photographed 2 days later with Confederate dead in the foreground. Hurd would have ridden that road in the back of an ambulance wagon on the night of the 17th, looking for wounded men in the dark. By the regimental orders book, Hurd was at the field hospital pitched on the Roulette farm, then at the Corps Hospital at Smoketown by the morning of the 18th. Smoketown was a tent city by then. About 600 wounded by the 19th, 1,400 by the 21st, 2,000 at its peak by the end of September. It would not finally close until May of 1863. Some men who came in from the cornfield on the 17th did not leave Smoketown alive until the apple blossoms were on the trees the next year. Here's the bit of period flavor I want you to hold in your head, because it explains the Apron. The Sanitary Commission, the great Northern Civilian Relief Organization, had been working the Maryland field hospitals since the 18th. By the 3rd day after the battle, the Sanitary Commission tents were stocked with cotton drill bolts, bandage rolls, beef extract, lemon juice, condensed milk, and dozens of bolts of unbleached muslin and white linen. Surgeons changed aprons 2 or 3 times a day in the heavy work because the blood went through the cloth in hours, and the cloth would not dry quickly enough in the September damp. There are accounts in the Sanitary Commission Bulletin, I have the bound volumes in the county library, of surgeons being handed a clean apron from a wagon every few hours, like a butcher in a slaughterhouse. I'm telling you this because the apron Hurd is wearing in the Gardner plate of the 20th is, by the chemistry of the stains, not the apron he started the 17th in. It is at least the 3rd or 4th he has been issued since the battle began. which means the ring on the apron has been transferred, taken off the old one, pinned to the new, at least twice and probably 3 times by the time Gardner exposed his glass at Smoketown. That is the action of a man who has decided that the ring stays with him, not in his pocket, not in his haversack with his other small things, on the apron, where he can see it. A small ironic note because I cannot help it. The same sanitary commission that handed Hurd his clean apron on the 20th was, at that same hour, taking custody of the apron he had taken off, the one he had been wearing through the sunken road wounded that morning, and sending it down the line to be boiled and bleached. The old aprons went into a steam laundry at Frederick. The clean cloth, by the records of the Frederick Depot, was reissued back to the field hospitals in some cases and turned into bandages in others. Most of it ended in the burn pile by November, which means that the apron in the Gardner plate is not the one in the attic case at the Lafayette Museum. The one in the attic, the one I will get to in Part 4, is the apron Hurd was wearing on a different day, possibly an earlier day, possibly a later one. The plate and the attic apron are not the same cloth. They are, however, almost certainly carrying the same ring. There is one more thing about the period and the place that you need to know before we go into the archive. The wounded Confederate on the pallet in the Gardner plate, the man with the kepi across his chest and the bandaged thigh. By the morning hospital muster of September 20th, Hurd's section of the Smoketown tents was holding 86 Confederate wounded against 64 Union. The Confederate wounded outnumbered the Union wounded in that part of the camp by a third. By the time the parole rolls were drawn up on October 5th, there were 796 Confederate enlisted men paroled out of Smoketown alone. Lee's army had crossed the Potomac with most of its walking wounded. The ones left behind were the ones too badly hurt to be moved on horseback. They came to Union surgeons because there was no one else. Hurd, by everything I can find in the regimental record, did not treat them differently. Not better, not worse, than his own. He worked the queue in the order in which men were brought to him, and he made the same triage decisions on a Mississippian he made on a Hoosier. There is one letter from a Mississippi private named Augustus Lee that surfaced in a Vicksburg antique shop in 1983. It is now at the Mississippi Department of Archives. The letter was written from Camp Parole, Annapolis, on November 4th, 1862, to his mother in Tishomingo County, and it says, "The Yankee doctor at the field hospital was named Hurd. He saved my leg, though I begged him to take it. He spoke to me kindly. He gave me a small drink of brandy from his own flask after the operation. I have heard since that he lost his wife not a year ago. Mother, I think when this war is over, I will go to Indiana and find him and thank him." I do not know if Augustus Lee ever went to Indiana. The parole rolls put him back in Mississippi by January of 63. He died of pneumonia at Vicksburg in May of 63, before the Confederate surrender of the city. He did not get to Lafayette. But he wrote the letter, and the letter is in the archive, and the letter says, "I have heard since that he lost his wife not a year ago," which means that on the Smoketown ward in late September of 62, somebody knew. Somebody had told the Mississippi private that the Union surgeon kneeling over him was a widower. Hurd had told the man himself, or one of the orderlies had told him, or the news had simply passed through the tents the way news passes in a hospital when the patients have nothing to do but lie on straw and listen. The widow's surgeon, the man with the dead wife, the doctor with the gold pinned to his apron. By the night of the 20th of September, 1862, Dr. Hurd had been awake for the better part of 4 days, with perhaps a few hours of dozing in a chair. Gardner and Gibson packed up their wagon and started back toward Washington with their exposed glass plates wrapped in green felt. One of those plates was the Smoketown picture of the surgeon and the wounded Confederate. The plate was developed in Brady's Washington studio in the days that followed. The first prints went up in Brady's display window on Broadway in New York sometime in mid-October 1862 as part of the exhibition, The Dead of Antietam. People came in off the street and stood in front of the glass for an hour at a time, weeping. The New York Times ran its now famous review on the 20th of October. The reviewer said, in the gist of it, that Brady had brought home the terrible reality of the war and made it impossible to look away. What none of the people on Broadway saw, what nobody in 1862 could have seen, because the resolution was not there, was the small, bright ring pinned to the surgeon's apron in the lower right of one of the plates. That ring would have to wait 140 years for the high-resolution Library of Congress scan that finally made it visible to the eye. When that scan came online in 2004, I remember the day I first opened it on my office computer. I sat in front of the screen for a long time and did not move, because I had already by then read the Lafayette Daily Courier of April 18, 1861. And I had already stood at Mary Heard's stone in Springvale Cemetery and read the date. And I knew the ring on the apron could not be hers. So whose was it? That is part 3. The Tippecanoe County Records Office is in the basement of the old courthouse on Main Street in Lafayette. The marriage registers for the 1850s are bound in calfskin volumes that you carry one at a time to a wooden table under fluorescent lights. The clerk who hands them to you signs the slip and reminds you not to use ink. I was there in October of 2004, 3 months after I'd first seen the high-resolution scan of the Gardner plate. I'd come looking for Mary's maiden name, and I had found it on a Tuesday afternoon. Mary Wheeler, married to Anson Heard on the 3rd of November, 1855, in the parlor of her father's house on Romig Street. That, I thought, was the answer. The ring would be a Wheeler family band, possibly her mother's, passed to her at the wedding and then back to Heard at her death. A reasonable enough story. Country surgeons did that. Sometimes the wife's wedding ring became the husband's mourning ring after she went. It would not have been remarkable in 1861. It would also not have explained the second ring in the velvet box at the museum. That box, when I went back to look at it on Wednesday, contained 2 plain bands, hers and his, both unmistakable as a matched country jeweler's pair. They had been bought together, sized together, engraved together. I have the engraving in my notes. AH to MW, November 3rd, 55 on the inside of one, MW to AH, November 3rd, 55 on the inside of the other. Anson Heard to Mary Wheeler to Anson Heard, both bands, in the same box. So Mary's wedding ring was already in Lafayette in 2004 in a museum case, and had been there since the Heard estate was probated in 1900. Heard had not taken it to Antietam at all. Then what was on his apron? I want to walk you through what I did next, because it is the part of archival work that almost never makes it into the finished story. I went back to the Heard letters at the museum. There are 4 of them, as I said. The 4th, the October 2nd letter, contains the line about Cousin Sarah and the ring. I had read that letter perhaps 30 times in the previous year, and I had assumed Sarah was a sister-in-law, or a Heard cousin in Crawfordsville, or one of the dozens of female names that ricochet through Indiana families in the 1850s. I had not actually looked for her, so I went and looked. Sarah Heard does not appear in the 1860 census for Tippecanoe County. She does not appear in the 1870 census for Tippecanoe or Montgomery County. She does not appear in the Methodist Parish Register of Lafayette or in the Crawfordsville Parish Register. Lemuel Heard of Crawfordsville, the cousin who got the letter, was married to a woman named Eliza, not Sarah. There is no cousin Sarah in the Heard family tree, as it was drawn up by a Lafayette amateur genealogist in 1946. I checked the Wheeler tree. There is no Sarah Wheeler of the right age either. For about a week, I thought the line in the letter might be a code. Soldiers wrote in code sometimes, agreed family code, to slip news past the Confederate cavalry that occasionally raided the mails. But Heard was not in territory where his letters were intercepted. The 14th Indiana was in Maryland in September and at Bolivar Heights by November. The mail was Union mail the whole way. There was no need for a code. Then on the 3rd of November of 2004, and I will admit this only because the date has a certain symmetry, I was sitting in the genealogy section of the West Lafayette Public Library, reading the diary of a woman named Hannah Bicker, kept between 1860 and 1863. Hannah was the wife of Dr. Cyrus Bicker, Heard's medical partner in Lafayette. The diary had been given to the West Lafayette Library in 1971 by her great-granddaughter. Most of it is the small daily record of a small-town doctor's wife. The weather. The births. The chickens. The price of flour at Schermerhorn's. Visits to Mary Heard in her last illness. Hannah had been the principal nurse during Mary's 6 days of childbed fever in April of '61. The entry for the 7th of April, 1861, 1 week before Mary died, reads, Mary Heard in great suffering. Dr. Heard cannot bear the room, sat with her 3 hours. She gave me her sister's ring to keep against the chance and asked me to put it on Anson's hand if she does not come through. Sister Sarah dead these 11 months in Memphis, and the ring is all she has of her. I promised. M sleeping now, the child quiet. God be with this house. Sarah was Mary's sister, not a Hurd cousin. Mary Hurd's older sister Sarah, dead 11 months before Mary in Memphis, of yellow fever, and from a separate civil registration check I did 2 weeks later in the Shelby County, Tennessee, records, I now know Sarah Wheeler had married a Memphis cotton broker named Pickett in 1853, taken his name, and died in the yellow fever epidemic of the spring of 1860. She left no children. Her widower remarried within a year, and Sarah's small personal effects, including her wedding band, were shipped back to her sister Mary in Lafayette. Mary, who would die 1 year later, gave the ring to Hannah Bicker on her own deathbed, with the instruction that it pass to Anson, as a remembrance not of Mary herself, but of Mary's sister. Hannah's diary records the moment. Hannah did exactly as instructed. When Anson recovered enough from his own grief to leave the house, 2 months after Mary's funeral, Hannah put Sarah's ring into his hand. Hannah's diary for the 14th of June, 1861, contains the line, "Gave A the ring. He understood. He said only, 'Then I will carry her too. I will carry her too.'" So the ring on the apron at Antietam was Sarah Wheeler Pickett's ring, Mary's older sister's wedding band, Hurd's sister-in-law's, a woman he had probably met perhaps 4 times in his life, at his wife's relations' houses, before she went to Memphis with her cotton broker husband and died of yellow fever in a hot Tennessee spring. The ring he carried into the war and pinned to his apron was the ring of a woman he had barely known. But it was the last remaining piece of Mary's family on the female side. The mother had died in 1856, the father in 1859, Mary in 61, the sister in 60. By Mary's deathbed in April of 61, the only Wheeler woman of her generation in possession of a wedding ring was Mary herself. And Mary's ring was already on her own finger and would stay there until Hurd took it off her hand in the laying out and put it in the velvet box with his own. Sarah's ring was the only Wheeler band still loose in the world. Mary had given it to her husband at one remove, through Hannah Bicker, because she could not give him her own. Her own was about to go in the velvet box and into the ground next to her gravestone in spirit, if not in fact. The ring on the apron was every woman who had loved him and was now gone. That is what Hurd carried into Smoketown. That is what is pinned to the cotton drill in the Gardner plate of the 20th of September, 1862. Hannah Bicker's diary entry of the 7th of April is the documentary proof, and the marriage register of Tippecanoe County for November of 55, and the Shelby County death record for spring of 60 for Sarah Wheeler Pickett. All 3 lines up. There is no ambiguity. The ring is Sarah's. I want to give you the moment when I sat in the West Lafayette Library and turned the page of Hannah's diary and read the words, "Sister Sarah dead these 11 months in Memphis." I had been chasing this for a year. I closed the diary and walked outside into the small parking lot behind the library. I sat on a bench and watched the leaves on a hickory tree for some time. It was a clear November afternoon. A small thing had clicked into place that had been off place for half a century. The ring was not what the museum card said it was. The museum card was honest but uninformed. The apron in the attic had come down through the family with no story attached, only the rumor that Surgeon Hurd kept his wife's ring with him through the war. The family had assumed Mary's. The plate in close detail says different. The diary makes it certain. The ring is Sarah's by way of Mary, by way of Hannah Bicker. I should say what I mean by certain because the word matters. The diary is signed in Hannah's hand. The handwriting matches her letters to her daughter from the 1870s, which are also in the library's holdings. The dates inside the diary are continuous and consistent with other Lafayette events of the period. There is a tornado on the 24th of June, 1861, which the Courier confirms. The diary mentions things only an intimate of the Hurd household would have known, including the unnamed infant son and Mary's particular request that the boy be baptized at home rather than at the church. The provenance is clean. There is no version of this in which the ring on the apron is Mary's. It is Sarah's. I want to bring you back to the field hospital at Smoketown now, because there is one scene from those days that I've been trying to fit somewhere and that belongs here. It comes from the Augustus Lee letter, the Mississippi private's letter to his mother, and from one corroborating note in the regimental medical book of the 14th Indiana, dated September 19th, where Hurd records, in a hand that is by then tired and sloping, an amputation refused and then performed. The patient in the medical book entry is a private of the 11th Mississippi, hit in the right thigh by a mini ball at the cornfield at about 9:30 on the 17th. The bone was shattered above the knee. By the morning of the 19th, the wound was already going to gangrene. The standard procedure was a primary amputation at mid-thigh. By the textbook, by the medical service's own circulars, by every surgeon in the camp. The patient refused. Augustus Lee, 20 years old, the eldest of 5, with a mother and a small farm in Tishomingo County waiting on him, told Hurd through tears that he would rather die than go home one-legged, because his mother had buried 2 boys already and could not feed a cripple. Hurd, by the medical book entry, sat with him for the better part of an hour. The book records, patient adamant, reasoned with at length, wound continuing to deteriorate, final discussion at 1 p.m. Then in the margin in Hurd's hand, a sentence in pencil that is not part of the official record and that was added later, perhaps days later, perhaps months. The pencil note says, "I told him, son, I can take the leg or I can take you home in a box to your mother. Choose by the time I count to 10. And then, in a different ink, he let me take it." He lived. That is the moment I think about more than any other in this whole story. A young Indiana surgeon, widowed, his dead sister-in-law's ring pinned to a borrowed apron, kneeling beside a 20-year-old Confederate boy from the Mississippi Pine Flats, counting to 10. The 2 of them in a tent in a Maryland orchard, with the cannon smoke still hanging in the trees and the apple leaves turning, and a number being counted out between them that decided whether the boy's mother got him back in 2 pieces or in 1 piece. There is something very small in that scene and very enormous at once. It is the war reduced to a household kitchen table argument, with an answer that has to be reached in 10 seconds. It is something that I think recognizes itself in every reader, no matter how far away the Civil War is from them, and no matter how little they know about the Mississippi Pine Flats or the 17th of September. Augustus Lee lived. Hurd amputated the leg cleanly at mid-thigh under chloroform. The boy was on the parole rolls of October 5th and back in Mississippi by January. He died of pneumonia, not gangrene, the following May at Vicksburg. He was buried in a mass grave at Soldiers' Rest Cemetery, since re-interned at the Vicksburg National Cemetery in 1866. His mother got back in the end only the news of his death by telegram in late May of '63. She wrote in her own hand on the back of the telegram, "He came home and went again. The Lord giveth and taketh away. Bless his name." That telegram is at the Mississippi State Archive, too. But Augustus did come home. For 4 months he came home. He came home because a widowed Union surgeon in a tent in Maryland counted to 10 over him and refused, on his behalf and against his will, to let him die for a notion. That is the small, ironic comfort in the story, and you can take it or leave it. I take it. What about Cousin Sarah, the line in the letter to Lemuel Hurd? "Tell Cousin Sarah I have the ring still, and it is safe." I have come finally to think that Cousin Sarah was Hurd's private name for the ring itself, for the carrying of it. The ring had become, in his hand and on his apron, the woman. It was the way men in the field talked about the things they loved. They named them. The ring was Sarah. Telling Lemuel that Sarah is safe was telling Lemuel that the carrying of the dead, of Mary's sister, of the unnamed infant son in the small grave next to her, was still being done. Lemuel was Hurd's only confidant in Indiana. The letter was a kind of report on the inner state of a widowed man on the field. Sarah is safe meant, I am still carrying them. The dead are still with me. The work is going on. This is interpretation. I am not certain. The family does not have an oral tradition on the Cousin Sarah line. When I asked the Hurd descendants about it in 2006, the great-grandniece I spoke with had never heard the name in the family at all. So either Cousin Sarah was something only Hurd and Lemuel ever used between themselves, and Lemuel never explained it to the next generation, or, and I think this is right, Sarah meant the ring. The ring meant the dead. The dead were Hurd's burden and his witness, and he kept them with him for the duration. By the time Gardner exposed his glass at Smoketown on the 20th, the ring had been on a series of aprons for the better part of a year, by my count. It would stay there, on a series of aprons for another 2.5 years. What happened to the ring after Appomattox and the small bitter thing they found in the lining of the attic apron in 1930 is the last part of this story. Appomattox in the second week of April, 1865, was warm and damp. The 14th Indiana had been at the surrender field on the 9th. What was left of the 14th, after 3 years of pretty hard fighting. The regiment had taken its last casualties at Sailor's Creek on the 6th. By the morning of the 10th, Hurd was at the Union Field Hospital outside the McLean House village, signing the discharge papers of his last few wounded, processing the small lists of men who would be on the cars back to Indianapolis by the end of the month. Dr. Hurd mustered out at Indianapolis on June 22, 1865. He had been in the field for 3 years and 10 months. He was 31 years old, had buried a wife, a sister-in-law, and an infant son before he ever heard a cannon, and had stood over an estimated 900 amputations and perhaps 400 deaths in the course of the war. The last of these figures is from his own diary, kept in a small leather notebook now in the county museum. He kept a private tally. He did not show it to anyone. The total, for what it is worth, is in his hand on the inside back cover of the notebook. 9 amps, approximately 900. Deaths under my hand, approximately 400. May God forgive what I could not do. May God forgive what I could not do. The hand is steady, but the pencil pressure is uneven. He wrote it on a single day. The diary suggests it was the day he came home to Lafayette and walked through the front door of the small farmhouse and looked at the kitchen, where Mary's rolling pin was still on the table, where Hannah Bicker had left it in April of '61. Untouched by anyone for 4 years and 2 months. He resumed his medical practice in Lafayette in the autumn of '65. He never remarried. He did not, by the parish record or by the Courier Society page, or by any of the Hurd correspondence I have read, ever court another woman. He took on the practice of his old partner, Dr. Cyrus Bicker, who had died, by no small irony, in 1864, of typhoid contracted from a returning veteran he was nursing, and he expanded it, and he became the principal doctor of the north side of Lafayette for the next 34 years. He delivered, by the count in the Courier on the occasion of his death, 4,093 children in his career. A handful of them are still alive in 1960, when a Lafayette reporter does a small piece on the surviving Hurd babies. He died on the 11th of December, 1900, of pneumonia. He was 66 years old. He had practiced medicine continuously for 43 years. His funeral procession ran from the Methodist Church on 6th Street out to Springvale Cemetery, where he was buried beside Mary and the unnamed infant son. The stone is set between theirs. The lettering on his stone is the same hand as Mary's, by which I mean he had chosen the inscription himself and left instructions with the Springvale stonemason in the 1870s. It reads, Anson Hurd, M.D., surgeon, 14th Indiana Vols, April 1834, December 1900, husband of Mary, restored to her at the end, restored to her at the end. The stone is still legible. I have stood at it 3 times. The first time was a damp October afternoon in 2003, before I had read Hannah Bicker's diary. The second time was on the 3rd of November of 2004, the same day I had sat outside the West Lafayette Library 2 months earlier, November 3rd being the day of Anson and Mary's wedding in '55. The third was in the spring of 2012, after the Hurd descendants had finally let me see the apron itself. The apron is the part that I have been postponing. Let me tell you what they found in 1930, when the attic case was opened. The Hurd farmhouse outside Lafayette had passed at his death to his cousin Lemuel's son, Edward Hurd, who farmed it until his own death in 1929. Edward's widow Emma went through the attic in the spring of 1930, sorting out what to keep and what to sell ahead of putting the farm on the market. In a small cedar trunk in the rafter space, wrapped in oilcloth that was beginning to brittle, she found a folded apron of cotton drill, brown with old stains, and a single sheet of penciled notes in Anson Hurd's hand from sometime in the late '70s. The notes were a small inventory. The apron from Smoketown kept, the ring returned to the box, the receipts of all that I carried in the lining. Let them lie. A.H. June 78. The receipts in the lining. When the museum conservator carefully opened the apron in 1931, working out from the apron strings, she found that the inner lining, the cotton band sewn around the inside of the apron's bib to take some of the strain when the apron was tied, had been opened at one end with a small slit, perhaps an inch and a half long. The slit had been hand-stitched closed afterwards with a different thread. Inside the lining were 5 small folded papers. 5 papers. I have seen all 5 of them. They are in the museum case now, beside the velvet box of rings. They are, in the order in which they were folded, from inside to outside. A receipt from Eli Schmidt, Lafayette undertaker, dated April 15, 1861, for 1 infant's coffin of pine lined with white cotton, $4.50, paid in full by A. Hurd, M.D. A small newspaper clipping from the Lafayette Daily Courier of April 18, 1861, the death notice for Mary, the one I have already quoted you. The folded edges are worn through. He had unfolded and refolded it many times. A page torn from a pocket hymnal, the hymn Abide With Me. The page is creased along 5 separate folds. There are no other markings. A receipt from Brady's Gallery, New York, dated the 2nd of November, 1862, for 1 carte de visite copy of The Surgeon at Smoketown, $2.25. Hurd had bought a print of his own photograph in Brady's window 6 weeks after Antietam while he was on a short medical leave in New York. He had then folded it into the lining of his apron and carried it through the rest of the war. And finally, in the outermost fold, a small square of plain, unmarked paper, folded into a tight square the size of a thumbnail, containing, when it was opened in 1931, a single human deciduous tooth. The tooth was identified by the museum conservator in consultation with a Lafayette dentist as belonging to a child of approximately 6 months of age. It had not been shed naturally. It had been extracted post-mortem, almost certainly during the laying out, by a hand that had wanted to keep something physical of the boy, the infant son's first tooth, the boy who had not lived long enough to be named. That is what Anson Hurd carried in the lining of his apron through 3 years of war, 3,000 operations, 900 amputations, 400 deaths under his hand. Not the obvious things, not the wedding ring of his wife, which stayed home in a velvet box, but the small, bitter things of his private grief. A coffin receipt, a clipped death notice, a hymn page, a photograph of himself, and the tooth of his son. The apron is in the museum case in